Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 10, Stratification and Social Class, Urban and Suburban Lifestyles. And hopefully you all had a relaxing Veterans Day. And to our veterans out there, we thank you for your service. So what we're looking at this week are social class stratification. So stratification means like layers. There's different layers of wealth and socioeconomic status, as we read in the chapter. So breaking that down, we have four major classes, and they were defined a few different ways, but for the intent of this course, we're going to look at it based on this slide and then what's in the study guide for the exam. So at the top, you have the upper class. The upper class usually is between 1 and 3%. We hear a lot of talk about the top 1% or top tenth of a percent. There's a lot of wealth there, but sometimes it's measured even to 3%, depending on who's doing the measuring. So very, very tiny percentage of society. And they live a very, very different life than you or I. They're categorized in two different ways, as we read in the text. You have old money versus new money. So old money is families that have had lots of wealth over many, many generations. And new money are those who maybe are one generation, two generations of having a lot of money. And sometimes they don't mix, but a lot of times they all belong to similar types of country clubs. Their kids go to private schools. They live in their own world. They have vacation destinations, hotels, resorts, things that ordinary folks don't have the money to visit. And so they're very detached from the rest of society. However, amongst that small group, because it's a much smaller number, especially when you're looking at the upper class within, let's say, New York City or the upper class in Los Angeles, many will know each other because they are parts of these very, very exclusive clubs and groups and schools, etc. Wealthy is an important distinction. We're going to talk more about that later, but the difference between income and wealth is often confused. Making a very high income can make you wealthy, sure, if you're a movie star or an athlete, one of the tenth of a percent that ever gets that good fortune, you can build wealth. But really, the upper class don't rely on an income. They have enough wealth, they own enough things, property, businesses, etc., financial interests, stock market, hedge funds, that they live off the interest from their wealth and their businesses rather than needing an income. Very different lifestyle. You have some top professionals in there, the top professionals being, again, we're talking about the top sport athletes, which would be mostly new money in many cases. Once in a while, you'll see, a top movie star, a top writer, but the vast majority of the professionals, 99.9%, are not in the upper class. So below the upper class, you have the middle class, and that's generally between 40 and 45% of society. Less than half are upper middle class. Upper middle class would be your majority professionals, educated professionals, managers. Then the majority of the middle class, about 60%, are just your mid-range managers, white collar jobs mostly, some blue collar jobs in the very, very high end. But the middle class used to be larger. Right now it's between 40 and 45%. The working class, excuse me, is sometimes called the lower middle class. But the working class generally are not white collar jobs, they're blue collar jobs. So they're not in management and they're not professionals. And generally working class don't have specific education requirements or have limited education requirements, more skills based. So that's 1/3 of society, annual income between 30 and 50. Again, our text is a bit old. In this chapter, we're looking at a lot of 2013, 2014 figures. So now it's a bit higher for the working class household income. This class, the working class, is the most vulnerable to financial crises, they and the lower class. Though middle class is also vulnerable, as we saw in 2008, which we will talk about a bit later. Lower class is about 20% of the population, and these are just basically service type of jobs, low prestige jobs, low incomes, minimum wage. And in total, about 12 to 13% of the US receive public assistance, food stamps, welfare, but it's a much smaller percentage that actually get any sort of welfare check. That would be a tiny percentage, and mostly all of that would be lower class. So this gives you an idea of income inequality. The percentage share, again, this is 2013. So this is a bit old, though it hasn't changed much since then. If anything, it's gotten a little worse. And after this, what we're entering now with the COVID recession, it's going to get even worse. But the lowest quintile, a quintile means a fifth, so 20%. So the lowest 20% of our population makes about 3.2% of all wages, while the highest quintile, the top 20%, make over 50% of all wages, and that's increased. So basically the highest quintile, that highest 20% of all income earners, is going to make more than everyone else, than 80%. The median income, there's a difference between mean or average income, which is you put everything together and divide it by the number, and median. Median would be the middle number. And sometimes this is better because it gives you a more accurate picture of the situation. With a mean income or average income, the problem is you could have 100 people and one person is a billionaire, and he's going to make the average much, much higher for all the other 99% and give kind of this false sense of that everyone's doing okay. With median income, it looks at where's the middle figure of all of the 100 incomes. And so this is a better barometer of how things really are going. So often that's used, especially when we're talking about socioeconomic status. We're looking at the difference between inside principal cities. This is in your central core cities. This is 2004, so it's going to be less than it is now. It's about $46,000 a year. Outside principal cities, so that would be your suburbs, it's around 60,000. Now the current figure total is around 70,000, so you can imagine that these have changed. And outside metropolitan areas, this would mean rural, so not part of a metropolitan area, is going to be the lowest. Now, one thing to also take into consideration is the cost of living. So obviously, if you're living in a rural area, it's going to be cheaper to live than inside a principal city or in many suburbs. So you have to take those things into account as well. We're looking at income inequality in the United States since 1980. 1980, big change in the way the United States approached the economy. You had Reagan era come in, and then you had the first Bush president, then later the Clinton 8 years, and then you had the second Bush administration, and then Obama at the end of that. And you saw this massive change. So in 1980, it used to be that the bottom 50% of workers made, about 21% of the total income. And the top 1% of income earners, again, this is income, not wealth, because it's far more of inequality when we talk about wealth, which we'll talk about in a second. But the top 1% of the US made around 11% of all income. We see that through the 80s, you had this change, the bottom 50% going consistently down and continuing down. And now we're looking at around 12 to 13% now, and it's probably going to get worse with the new recession. And the top 1%, with, again, this is income, starting to make 20% of all income. So this tells you there's massive disparity. And we see this now when we see a CEO of a company making so much more money than they used to. It's really inverted here, and it's a continuing problem that started. It's had cycles throughout the history of the United States, but especially a lot of the gains in the post World War II through 1970s, the gains for workers and more equality and sharing the wealth kind of disappeared in 1980 and onwards. So wealth, net worth, and poverty. So wealth are all financial and market assets. So this is what someone owns. Yeah, it's income obviously can create wealth, but wealth is what really separates the upper class and the top percent from everyone else. And net worth is how much wealth one has. So it's the assets, everything one owns, minus the liabilities, everything that is owed. So let's say someone has $1 million home, beautiful home, actually average home in San Diego, unfortunately, and they owe $900,000 for the mortgage. So their net worth, provided they have nothing else, would be $100,000, not $1 million. We look at, very famous people. One, look at the president. He owns lots of different properties, but they're highly mortgaged. They have liabilities against those. So if he owns billions of dollars of properties but owes billions of dollars, then obviously the net worth is going to be low. We had the housing and mortgage crisis. Some of you are old enough to remember this well. Some of you may not, you were young. And this happened between 2007 and 2013. Each area was a little bit different. Some areas it lasted longer than others. And during that time, 12 million foreclosure filings went through the system, which is a lot. And we saw the value of homes go down quite a bit. In total, 2/3 of US families suffered financial damages, and minorities disproportionately higher, exponentially higher than everyone else. What happened, it's a complicated situation, but basically you had lots of different actors doing things that probably were not in the best interest for the long term. So in 2000, we had some rules related to mortgages and banking deregulated. The regulations were removed, and this opened the door for lots of different types of banks, especially large Wall Street banks, to get into the mortgage business. And when they did, they started compiling what we call securities, these large bundles of thousands of mortgages, and buying and selling them on the stock market and giving them very high ratings. So Wall Street wanted more and more of these mortgage-backed securities. And the banks were more than happy to give out mortgages. They wanted to sell as many as they could, because once they sold a mortgage to a customer, they could sell that mortgage to one of these large mortgage security trading companies and make a lot of money. And they didn't have to worry in the long term if the customers would actually be paying it back, because they were mortgages in general were rated very high. Why? Because people thought, well, worst comes to worst, they foreclose, you get the bank gets the house. The problem is, when you have this disconnect with those giving mortgages to families who are not from the area and selling it to banks from all over the world and Wall Street and New York, and you lose that connection with what's going on the ground on Main Street. And so you had mortgages being given to many, many people at very low rates who maybe shouldn't have gotten into that much of a mortgage and wouldn't have been allowed to do so in the past, because of the situation and context was different. The other thing you had going on, part of these deregulation efforts, you had mortgage rates that were teaser rates. So they were variable rate mortgages. So they would get someone in at a very, very low percentage rate, but then in the 30 pages of the mortgage document, they had the power to raise the interest rate at whatever time for basically for whatever reason. And this happened to many people. They'd get in on a low rate, all of a sudden it would increase tremendously and they're paying 500, $1,000 more dollars a month, and then they couldn't afford it. And then the bubble burst, all of these mortgages became toxic, and the homes that they thought they could sell, when you have so many of these homes going into foreclosure, so many hitting the market at the same time, the value for the homes dropped considerably. And this put us in a terrible recession, the worst since the Great Depression. And that was in 2008. Obama administration takes over at that time, and they had a massive mess to clean up, and had to put billions of dollars into the economy through the Recovery Act. And we'll see later, they actually did a good job in getting the US out of that terrible recession. During this time, unfortunately, when you had the crisis, there's always those who can take advantage of that situation. So for those with a lot of wealth, it was used as an opportunity when the prices and the bubble burst and the prices went down on lots of homes and buildings and properties, commercial properties. They were bought up for pennies on the dollar by certain groups. You had many banks that failed or were in trouble, and then they were bought up by larger banks. The big fish kept eating the little fish, so the big fish usually does fine. We look at wealth disparity right now, or 2018, the top 1%, this is wealth and what they own, not income, had over 25 trillion in wealth. That's the top 1%. That's more than all the goods and services produced for that year was owned by 1%. That's Brookings Institute. And of all of the wealth in the United States, the 1% owned 38.5%. The wealthiest 19% after that, so we're still in the first top quintile, own 53.5% of all wealth, buildings, land, securities, etc. So you add those together, and you're looking at over 90% of all wealth in the top quintile. And as you see here, 80% of the population owning between 5 and 6% of everything else, the scraps, for the rest of society. After wealth, we look at poverty. The poverty rate is designated in the US. It's going to be different than what's designated in Mexico or Canada. Similar to Canada, more similar than Mexico, or if we look at countries in Africa, it's going to be different. But the poverty rate in the US was 14.5% in 2013. And we're going to look at another chart in just a second. 2019, it had gone down to 11%. And that really, the poverty rate started going down quite tremendously during the second Obama term, and continued to slightly go down until 2019, or about stabilized during the Trump administration. Though unfortunately, with this current pandemic recession, we're going to see that poverty rate rise. It's very connected to employment, and employment is, as we know now, unfortunately, unemployment is rising and rising. It may not look like it when we see unemployment rates dropping, but we have to remember that the unemployment rate after a certain period of months stops counting those who still don't have a job. They only are counted during a certain limited time period. Afterwards, they're considered basically like a disenfranchised worker. So 84% of poverty in the United States is native born, 5% naturalized, and the remaining 11% are non-citizens. So sometimes there's this incorrect stereotype that the poor are people, are immigrants, and that's not true. Only 11% of those in poverty. So if we look at poverty in the United States, we look back at 1960. and that was around 22.4%, so it's quite high. You had some things changing in the 60s, especially related to Medicare, Medicaid, things like that. The Social Security Act had been in place, but now more people were living longer and taking advantage of it. So these social programs from the 40s, 50s, and 60s started to make a dent. And along with that, really, probably more than anything else, you had the United States in post World War II uh, having a lot of success in production and in industry, and then you had a lot of success with unions working for higher wages, et cetera. So by the end of the 60s, it was down to around 12.6%. And as you've seen since then, it goes up and down between around 11% and 15%, depending. This chart, if you look at the orange spots, they're going to be near recessions. And so we see at the end of the 80s, you had a recession, or excuse me, the beginning of the 80s, you had end of the 70s into the beginning of the 80s, there was a recession, followed by the economy doing well. By the end of the 80s, there was another recession that was actually fairly bad. I remember that one, and cost George H.W. Bush his presidency. And then you saw in the 90s, economic situation was very good. You had to drop in poverty consistently. Get to 2000, we had September 11th brought on a recession and the war on terror that was little bit. Poverty increased, it went down a bit, and then you had the massive recession in 2008, and that again brought poverty up to 15%. Then you see throughout 2012 onward, roughly, you saw the poverty rate go down, and then it went down to 11% last year. So it had been going down since really Obama's second term into the Trump administration. And now probably it's going to go back up with another recession. And I just wanted to show you this so you see the patterns. If we look at people in poverty, the percentage, again, this is 2013 percentage, but the main reason we're looking at it is because we're seeing the difference between inside principal cities, your core city, outside principal cities, your suburbs. You're going to have a little bit less poverty. And this is the total amount in the country. And then outside metropolitan areas, it's about 16% of the total, the rural areas. So poverty is everywhere, unfortunately. Also wanted to show you this. This is the unemployment rate for people 16 years and older and quarterly averages. And this is seasonally adjusted. This is US Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so we see with unemployment, and I wanted to find something that matched unemployment with poverty, but I couldn't. But if we look at unemployment rates, you see them, going higher and higher throughout, higher up and down through the late 60s and the 70s. And then you see this massive drop in 1982, about 83. Well, part of it was the economy was doing better, but part of it also is we had a change in how we measured unemployment. And that's where we get the limited time period, those receiving unemployment benefits, essentially calculating the unemployment rate. Then after one's unemployment runs out, they're no longer calculated. So with that change in the calculation, obviously the percentage is going to go down, but the real unemployment rate is probably as higher or higher. You see again with the recessions, each of these recessions in 1990, roughly 2001, and then 2008, you see this massive spike in unemployment. What we don't see on this graph is the current situation where it spiked extremely high into the summer. It started to go down as we started to reopen society. However, as we see now, we're in the worst state of COVID yet. So there may be some more closing down and more unemployment. But with any of these spikes, you're going to see it taper off because after a while, again, when the unemployment runs out, those are people are no longer considered unemployed. So middle class urban neighborhoods. This is Chicago on the right, and this is from the text. And I'll just go to the graph quickly. So basically what this shows is, and you can see the same graph in your text, and as you read, they describe it, but the 22, 24, 28, 33, this kind of a, I don't know what type of blue, green color that is, but basically these are areas that are being gentrified and becoming hip areas. So they were previously lower income or low middle income, and now they're becoming middle or higher income areas because they're being gentrified. And gentrified means that wealthier people are moving to the area, buying property, building homes, and unfortunately part of a gentrification process is that those who are living there originally all of a sudden cannot afford to live there anymore. And we see that happening in San Diego all the time. People grew up in a certain area, now it's a hip area, and they could, can't, the house that was 200,000 20 years ago is now $1 million. And average working folks just can't afford to live there anymore. Well, this is happening in all the major cities. So yuppies is a term, young urban professionals, that's been used since the 80s. Dinks, that means dual income, no kids. So these are two, usually referring to professionals. And so they have lots of money to spend on a property and they don't have kids to spend the money on. And hipsters, could be yuppies, and dinks could also be hipsters. And they come in and renovate these neighborhoods and add value. You see in these areas the opening of boutiques, cafes, restaurants, unique retail establishments. All of these things add up and start to increase the value. Some people really like it. They feel it improves the area. Even those originally living there who can still afford to hang on to their property, or they see the benefit with their property value going up. Some people, especially renters, hate it because now they can no longer to live where they've lived for a long time. So in Chicago, you see in these specific areas a 12% increase in residents age from 25 to 39. So that's like the core age, these young professionals to come in for the gentrification process to begin. And you see also a double-digit increase in proportion that went to college or have college degrees. That's very common for these type of areas. The increase in per capita income, and then gentrification occurs. So looking at the homeless, this is just a very, very brief look into the homeless. The text doesn't give it too much. It's very, very minimal and lacking, if you want my honest opinion. But just to touch on it, the homeless population, first thing that one has to realize is homeless population, even in areas where we go to San Diego or Los Angeles, we think, wow, there's so many homeless. It's really a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of the population. It's a very, very small percentage, but they're very visible. And so this gives the impression that there's more homeless than there actually are. The majority have a mental or physical disability. Unfortunately, many homeless are veterans, could be suffering from PTSD and other issues. You had an increase in homeless after wars, the Vietnam War, Iraq War, Afghanistan. A large portion of homeless suffer from substance abuse and addiction. We see that a lot. Usually it's a combination of many different things. Another primary factor is that it used to be in most states, every county had a hospital. It would be called a variety of things, the state hospital, county hospital, many, many different names over the last few hundred years. And basically anyone with mental condition, an addict, you name it, they were put into these state hospitals. And some of them were awful, and had terrible documentaries made about them. If you watch any of these ghost shows, you see they're always going to this old hospital or infirmary or this one, and they there's just so many that closed over the last 50 years. And when they closed these hospitals, they moved a lot of the treatment for these people to outpatient treatment, meaning they would go get their services and live, on their own or in a group home or somewhere else. The problem is many of those people uh, wouldn't continue. They were more likely to not continue with the services, mental health and other services, and go back to a life on the street. They weren't being locked up. So this has created this, large homeless, not large, but more than it was, homeless population since the 70s, 80s in the US. And you see that all across the US. California is going to have a bit more, it's a little more transient state in general. Also, I mean, if you're homeless, you can't get better weather than the coast here in California. Another factor leading to this, the single room occupancy hotels, many have been destroyed. So a lot of these places where people would have lived were either in the cities, predominantly in major cities, were these one room buildings, and they were closed. And the reason why the city feels that they would brought drug addicts, it brought problems, criminals, and so they wanted them out. And so the cities would rally to get rid of some of these places. And when they're destroyed, there's nowhere else for a lot of people to go, unfortunately. Now, a new trend in the homeless, uh, unfortunately, we see this in California due to the skyrocketing cost of living. 44% are employed, and that's pretty mind-blowing. 30% of homeless are family. Still, the majority are single adults. Very small percent are unaccompanied youth. And many of the family or women with children are homeless due to domestic abuse. Usually that's the absolute primary reason, but it could be in conjunction with substance abuse or other issues as well. So suburban social class diversity. So we went from one extreme to the next. So as we read in the text, Pierre Lorillard in 1886 bought a bunch of land and created these country club, Tuxedo Park, which were cottages. I'm doing air quotes because you see pictures on the right of two of those cottages, again, air quotes. I would like to live in that cottage any day of the week, that's for sure. And these were for club members from New York City and other, major cities, probably Boston as well, and denied entry to minorities. Only the very most wealthy could afford to live there, and this created their own elite club, and they'd have their own prep schools, and they had really a lifestyle away from the rest of the world in these very elite enclaves. And those were your first, if you're looking at the first suburbs, a lot of them were upper income. They were either in the most extreme sense, like the Lorillard, the Tuxedo Park, or they were upper middle class suburbs, as we talked about before, which were on the light rail lines, just out of the city. Middle income suburbs came about, as we talked about, primarily after World War II. And much of those suburbs, it's, as we read in the text, it's family and child-centered activities. So in many cases, the families, raise their children away from the perceived evils of the city. Generally fewer poor, but things are changing. It used to be a lot of these suburbs were very white, the white flight from the cities, but now we're seeing that middle class and upper middle class minority groups move into the suburbs, especially Asians. And so you're getting more of a class separation than racial. Not to say there's still not racism. There's unfortunately tons of racism mixed in, but there is some areas where, as we read in the text, where race is less of a factor than class, but still a factor nonetheless. Working class suburbs, these were developed in the early 20th century. You see a picture in the top left. And these were generally suburbs built around a factory or several factories or industry, and in some cases specifically built for workers for a factory. And at first, a lot of these working class suburbs, you would have a high number of ethnic whites and then some African Americans. So in the early 20th century, you'd look at this would be, predominantly a Polish working class suburb, or Irish or Italian, or a mix of those, with perhaps some African American, but probably not much in that area. And these have not stood the test of time very well, unfortunately. The working class suburbs have deteriorated and in many cases face the same blight cycle you see in the larger cities. In some cases, the blight cycle the larger cities went through, the larger cities have started to recover, but the working class suburbs in many cases have not. So now they're the new blighted areas. And of course, a lot of that has to do with industry moving out from those areas and not providing for the workforce. Suburban cosmopolitan centers, we talked about this before and use different names for some of these things, but these are your suburban cities that are more usually a college town, or there's technology firms and there's a lot of professionals, a very high education base. They represent the cosmopolite residential neighborhoods of central cities. Example, Palo Alto, California, Princeton, New Jersey, and Ann Arbor, Michigan, here on the left. So they're kind of this very cosmopolitan, upper middle class, creative centers. And minority suburbs exist. You have some cases like a picture on the top to the right, which is a middle class, predominantly African American suburb and minority suburb. Usually it's near a core city or central city, African American, or it could be Latinx or other groups. And then it just kind of, those ones who are middle class or middle income or professionals move into the suburb area near it. So it's usually they're a bit higher income than the corresponding city section that they're near. If we look at suburbs in general, the 35% of the suburban population across the US now is minority. So that's changed quite a bit in the last 50, 60 years. Recently, now African Americans, there's more than 50% live in suburbs as compared to cities or rural, which is a big change. 59% of Hispanics now live in suburbs. The highest is Asians, 62% of Asians, and that could be East Asians or South Asians. East Asian be China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, where South Asian, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And generally, suburbs are becoming more racially diverse. Some still are pretty segregated. One comes to mind in Metro Detroit, a suburb called Livonia, and it is right next to Detroit, which is a very high percentage, of 70% African American, yet somehow maintained 95% white in a middle class suburb bordering Detroit for decades until now. And a lot of that was unfortunately very redlining, racism, and other tactics. You've seen a pattern with some suburbs where minority groups will move in and then the whites groups may leave. You also see a pattern beyond race where minority groups or lower income groups move in, and then those with higher socioeconomic status move further out and further out into the suburbs, usually becoming more expensive and exclusive. We talked about the spillover communities that's from the minority suburbs, outgrowth from center city. And that's all over Cleveland, Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit. You see it all over. And then the upwardly mobile suburbanization. So the text is basically showing us that the white cocoon, so to speak, while it still exists here and there, doesn't fit as well as it used to now because it's more based on socioeconomic status. And that is it. And hopefully all of you are doing well, and we'll get back to the regular schedule next week. So have a great weekend, and I look forward to reading your discussions.